Welcome to another episode of the System 2 podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with my friend, Oliver Libby, who you started working in the federal government and national security. And then you became a venture capitalist entrepreneur. You started HL Ventures, where you've done a lot of investments, as well as City Rock, which we can dive into. And now you are also the author of a new book called Strong Floor, No Ceiling. So Oliver, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks, Mate, for having me on the show.
Strong Floor, No Ceiling. It's a political book, but you are a venture capitalist. It's a moderate position on politics, strong floor component with upside. Do you think this can also be framed into a more capitalistic framework where if you think about venture investing, you're being handed a bunch of money from an investor? Some might call that a strong floor that you can then use to grow a business with unlimited upside. How has your venture capital background influenced your political viewpoints, especially in writing this book?
There's no Strong Floor, No Ceiling book without my time in venture capital. Building HL Ventures and City Rock Venture Partners has been an enormous honor, and it's still a work in progress. But I think even more so, you don't get Strong Floor, No Ceiling without me being a cross-sector person. I always joke around that I'm a cross-sector animal. I started in the federal government. Once you do that, you don't really leave the worlds of policy, and I've spent years still interacting with elected leaders and folks throughout the government. And then I went over to the consulting world and learned spreadsheet and balance sheets, and reasonably quickly graduated into running a venture firm and also a global nonprofit. And so the combination of all those sectors is what let me kind of this perch from which I could have the insight for Strong Floor, No Ceiling, and then write the book. The book, though, to your question, is very much an investor's book. Both the strong floor and the no ceiling components are heavily informed by investing. The strong floor has policies in it that would normally be associated with the social safety net. So a lot of the things about the floor are things like affordable healthcare, affordable education, broadly available, affordable housing, good paying jobs, justice and safety for you and your home and your community. Those are also expensive, but in a sense, they're investments in a population, because actually for our economy, it's good to have well-educated, talented workers. It's good for those workers to be able to afford things and consume. It's good for them to be healthy and lives, and therefore able to then build, invent things, companies, small businesses, and thrive. And so that investment in the strong floor is what gets us this vibrant community and this vibrant economy. But the bargain is, if you want that strong floor, there should be no ceiling to what you can aspire to build. If you build a great company, if you invent something amazing, if you cure a cancer, then accruing great wealth should be not only fine, but celebrated. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have expectations and rules around wealth in this country, but the no ceiling is the payoff. And without that, you don't get an economic pie that increases. You see, a lot of politics today assumes a static pie. The far left wants to redistribute something that is finite, and the far right wants to say that we're fighting over these scraps. I would say not at all. I think in our industry, Mate, we know we can increase the size of the pie through technology and things. So that's another meaning for no ceiling.
I really like the floor characterization as an investment, because you see, and you do a great job throughout this book of talking to both sides of the aisle and addressing some of the objections that they might have, starting with the floor component. And some people might see that as like, why would I want to give a handout or a safety net to somebody, when it seems like, oh no, like that's for someone on the right, that's a no-no. But at the same time, going back to the investor framework, that is exactly what you're doing. Speaking as an entrepreneur, when you, as an entrepreneur, you go to a venture capitalist asking for money to help fund this idea that you're building. And so we're very comfortable with this floor component in the most capitalistic parts of our economy. And yet in certain political contexts, that's seen as, oh, that's not quite an investment. Yeah, like your point about having like no upside but following the rules as well is a way to just make sure we have like a vibrant like framework that you can operate in to create predictability that then helps these companies and different initiatives grow. You dive deeper into the book, because the book is not just this is the idea, although I think it's very important to focus on the core idea and to have it be very simple, have it be a slogan, but then there's a lot of meat that goes behind it. How do you think about breaking down this like strong floor, no ceiling into what does it actually take to get?
A lot of really important questions in one. Let me try and remember to handle all the parts of that. First, one of the things I imagine some of your listenership, like me, are fans of science fiction, fantasy, world building. And one of my favorite things about that is for every page that's actually in Lord of the Rings, there's tens or hundreds of pages of Tolkien inventing things, drawing maps, building languages. So even if strong floor, no ceiling is but a 4-word slogan, it felt important for it to have the depth of 75,000 words of actual policy. But then the question becomes, what chance do we have of making this happen? And there's two parts of that answer. The first is found in actually literally chapter 2 of the chapter 2 of the is a chapter that actually emerged late in the writing because I was struggling with this very same idea of like, oh, what chance do we have to do this? And so chapter 2 involved the idea of a national service program, a multi-track one, not just military service, but some way to reconnect us to each other. A part of that idea also is something called the REC Centers, which is the American Reconnecting Energy Center, revitalization essentially, and trying to take care of loneliness in our communities. There's a long discussion of social media and what that has done and certain guardrails that I think should be in place that are commensurate with being a pro-innovation person, but also understanding that social media has wrought damage to our polity. And then last but not least, some of the operations of our democracy are broken, particularly gerrymandering and money in politics. Making voting easier, particularly with technology, could also be a really wise thing to do. And with those things in place, we would have a better chance of enacting a big swath of policies. But the other part of the answer is really important. If we just pause for a second and think about the last few times where America has made a huge leap forward in massive packages of legislation and things that changed lives for everybody in the country. The 1930s, a tough time, right? You have the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, 25% unemployment. You've got the rise of fascism around the world. You've got wars breaking out. And yet somehow at the end of that time in World War II, you get the New Deal. In the same way in the 1960s, it must have felt a lot like it did today. And we've got leaders being gunned down, and Jack and Bobby Kennedy, MLK, and dozens of cities on fire. You've got the Vietnam War and kids getting yanked out of school to be conscripted into the service in a war that was broadly unpopular. And then somehow we get the Great Society. And so it is at times where we might feel the most challenged, dark, hopeless, despairing that we actually manage to achieve great things if we earn it, right? It wasn't easy to do those things. And so I think this book calls upon us to once again earn the right to have great things come out of a dark time.
I love starting the conversation on that point in that chapter because I couldn't agree more. And it's often that through these hard times that great things happen. I have a number of friends who are in the military, and particularly the special forces. And I've become fascinated with the military as an institution and how it can take a bunch of strangers who within a short amount of time are willing to take a bullet for each other. There's something very raw and primal about knowing that the people next to you are going to take a bullet for you. And we used to have that when we lived in villages and in our tribes, not to say this was paradise, but it does mean that when the enemy was at the gates, you can count on the people next to you to have your back. And one of the interesting points that one of the veterans made is that he's like there were guys that I served with who were assholes and they were just bad human beings. And yet I had no doubt in my mind that they would take a bullet for me and I would take a bullet for them. Imagine if that was the country that we lived in, where we don't agree on values, but we would still take a bullet for each other. And if you actually look at how this gets developed, how does an institution create those kinds of bonds? Because this doesn't happen randomly. And it is often through shared hardship that even in trainings, you can simulate this, where through the Navy SEALs in Hell Week, where they go through a very intense training process, they come out of it on the other side feeling the sense of brotherhood and connection to the other people that they can then down the road when they disagree on something, they can still fall back on, yeah, we went through some hard things together and we now have that shared perspective, which exactly to your point, we no longer have or share as a country.
And I don't know that we've ever perfectly had that, but we have had way more of it in the past. It is important to note what happened to our society after World War II. World War II was the kind of full-body effort that we might have had in various ways after 9/11. There might have been a chance for us to call upon the entire society to do something together again in a way that we elected not to do. But in World War II, got about just over 100 million people in the country. 10 million of them are in the military. Another 20 million are engaged in the industrial effort for the war. Most every other person was contributing to war bonds. And so there's just not a corner of our society that isn't affected by that war. What happens after that war? We have 20 years of absurd economic progress, right? GDP, doubling frequently during that period. but we also make enormous social gains, right? That's when you get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and much of the Great Society. And I believe that it came from this kind of sense of shared seriousness and struggle where I'll give you one very concrete example from the book. The U.S. military did something unusual going into World War II, which is we decided as a society to fight not regionally in our units, but by specialization and to mix people up. So you get that trope, if you've ever seen a war movie or Band of Brothers or whatever, where you've the Jewish guy from the deli who's with the Tennessee farmer, who's with the sniper from Arkansas, who's with the rich kid from Harvard, who's the lieutenant. But somehow, to your point, they're all in the trenches getting shot at together. And then when they come home, it's really hard for them to look at the black guy who might have been, yes, in World War II still, in the rear echelons of their unit, but with their unit in danger, and to discriminate against that person. And so you start to get a sense of why it was that we were able to make such tremendous progress. And my search in the beginning of chapter 2 of the book is for what we call the American service experience, because without getting into a place where your life is literally in danger, there is so much where we can do to mix our society up. We've done something in this country very sad, which was we have geographically and digitally sorted ourselves up. In the time of the Kennedy-Nixon campaign, fewer than 20% of counties in America were landslide counties, as in decided by more than 20% of the vote. That has tripled since then. And so we live next to people who think what we think. We interact online with people who think what we think. And we have lost the capacity to have a reasonable, shared dialogue with people who disagree with us. That is a national tragedy.
Yeah. I actually want to spend more time on this point because the American servants experience that you describe in this chapter is foundational, in my opinion, to creating the rest of the policies here, where if you have people that can agree on something, that have gone through a shared hard experience in their youth, that they can come together to accomplish a lot more afterwards. I would love for you to spend a little bit more time talking about it. It's not just, okay, military service is one way to create this, but you list here a bunch of others. Love to hear more.
And Mate, I don't want to hold myself out on an expert in national service programs. There are people who are much smarter about this than I am. But my thought was that probably for high school, everyone's got to do something in what I call the American service experience. There are 6 tracks in what I thought up. Obviously, the military is always an option. There would also be 2 options around essentially a community level infrastructure work. So Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, that is whether you want to work in communities here in America or overseas. I will footnote the fact that the Trump administration has really taken a lot of the heart out of those organizations, but I believe they could be rebooted. So that's really important if you want to get your hands into, really the soil or the infrastructure of towns, communities, villages at home or abroad. Those are options. There's a kind of a Teach for America proxy. I mean, teaching is something we need a lot more people to do, and to taste being in the classroom and changing students' lives could change the lives of those who are doing that teaching. There is an infrastructure core a la FDR New Deal, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure to build in this country. A lot of it is not particularly skilled labor, but, just gravel and all sorts of stuff like that. And then last but not least, there's an idea of volunteering in your local government, connecting yourself to the civic polity, if you will. And so, might be 7 things, might be 5 things, but your point is, without necessarily slapping a gun in your hand, how do you have shared experiences? And very importantly in this program, you can't do it at home. So even if you did a local government version of this, you'd have to go to another community and volunteer in their local government. And so I think that's a really important way to make some progress here.
Yeah. Sharing those experiences with others. And they become core memories. I've talked to many people, and you ask them to tell you their story, and it starts off with when I was in the Peace Corps and I did this thing and it changed my life, and then it led me down this track. The storytelling component is huge. And to focus a little bit on the military side of it, only a certain number of people that are in the military, and to your point, they become much more segregated, where I honestly didn't know anyone in the military until I got introduced to that community, and now I've met a lot more of them. And that's a shame. And going back to the experience, your point about the post-World War II experience, when people came back, people contributed to that war effort. And it was also stories. Like you mentioned, Lord of the Rings, that he was a soldier. There is a rich history of soldiers sharing their stories. And today I have one of my friends is a former Green Beret who, after the military, decided he wanted to be an actor. And his point was like, no, this was actually done way before. If you go back to Homer and the Odyssey, soldiers were those people that left their tribes and did something interesting and saw humanity at its best and its worst, and came back, importantly, and told stories about that, and got other people to feel these emotions. that then got more people to connect with that experience, however limited it may be. And so yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts on the storytelling piece of it. I mean, you are telling a story through this book and how you think about the power of stories in shaping our collective identities.
My sister came up as a scholar of Latin and Greek, and her great work out there is talking about how mythology was actually a useful political tool. Because stories are everything. Think about it. Can you touch America? Why does the Stars and Stripes matter to us? It's not because that little of fabric matters, but people die for the flag. And it's because of the stories we tell and the shared value that we have imbued to those things. And by the way, I think a lot about national threats. And I have said frequently, some of your listeners may have already heard me say that a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 doesn't destroy America. It can give us pain. It can be tragic. It can be something we have to and go to war over, as we did in both those cases. But ultimately, that doesn't rip apart the fabric of America. The death of the American dream certainly will. When you think about the failure of great society, usually that happens internally. And the story that we have told each other about if you work hard, if you do right, if you follow the rules, you ought to be able to get yours in this country. And that's called the American dream. And not only that, but you ought to be able to leave your kids better off than you were. And the fact that that story actually was true for most parts of our society, for most of our history, is probably one of the primary reasons we've been successful. And the fact that that is not only no longer actually true, but even more importantly, the perception is that it's not true. 27% of Americans believe the American dream works today. That, Mate, is the end of the game here if we don't fix it. And part of the problem is the far left would have you believe that the death of the American dream is at the hand of wealthy people, and it's their fault. And the far right would say that it's at the hand of large groups of Americans that are on the take. And I think both of those things are wrong. And at the end of the day, it's actually about getting our whole society working together in a system that promotes the floor, removes the ceiling, and gets the American dream working again for a broad swath of our society.
Speaking of the American dream and stories, I know you wear a bracelet that is part of your family's American dream. Do you mind sharing that story?
I'd be happy to. Every day of my life since I was about 3 years old, I wear my great-grandfather's French Army dog tags. He was an extraordinary guy, very tall, and both a kind of tall and a tall tale in our family's history. My grandmother kept his dog tags with her and waited until I was old enough to ask her the question, what is war? And she kind of silently went off and got these dog tags, which are worn on the wrist. And she brought them back for me, sized for my wrist. So she kept all the links so that they're now also able to fit me. And she told me the story of her dad. Her dad was conscripted into the French military at the dawn of World War I, was badly wounded at the kind of legendary First Battle of the Marne, where soldiers were defending Paris, going off to the front in taxi cabs and buses, stopped the Germans 30 miles short of Paris. He's wounded very badly. He's told he's not going to be able to walk again probably, and certainly can't go back to his squad mates, which was tragic. So instead, he manages to find another way to fight, which is to be a pilot. And he's a reconnaissance pilot, a fighter aircraft, where, your weapon, a 38, and you got some grenades in your lap, and that was what you got. He left the military service after World War and became a lawyer at a large department store in Paris. And when World War II broke out, he was 53, but he gets reconscripted. And he's in a reserve battalion and is captured when Paris is surrounded during the Blitzkrieg. A French command and control had failed by that point, and had somehow had the foresight to connect with an American cousin and see to it that my grandmother, her sister, and their mom, his wife, were taken out of France and brought through England to New York City, which is how we come to be here. And the reason I tell that whole story for your listeners is because basically, he escapes from the POW camp, gets shot again as he escapes, and manages to make it to the family in one of those like story movie things where he shows up on the doorstep and they hadn't heard from him for months, and there he was. Again, I tell you this story because now when anything happens in like business, if there's a crappy day at the office, I just look at this bracelet and I'm like, well, it can't be that bad, right? And that is why I wear it every day. And it connects me to a time in history where the suffering was very real.
Yeah. As a continuation of that family story, and also to address one of the main chapters of the book, I'm curious how your experience growing up around the healthcare system, with its glories, you're helping people, but at the same time, there are tons of inefficiencies and bureaucracies and things that just plain don't make sense, has then influenced your thought on healthcare is one of the pillars of what needs to be fixed.
The scientific frontiers of healthcare are one of the most inspiring things in the world. The business of healthcare is one of the dumbest things in the world. My grandfather won a Nobel Prize. My great-great-uncle also won a Nobel Prize. My parents were both, my mom was a renowned OBGYN. By the way, when I say all that, I don't mean that in any way to be a brag, because you would not want me to be taking care of you as a physician. I was terrible in science growing up, and I had to find something else to do with my life. But growing up around that was really inspiring. It gave me a sense of a kind of meritocracy and egalitarianism, because you cannot imagine like the makeup of my grandfather's laboratory at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. It was like from every corner of the earth, the best of the best. And there was like a German doctor, a woman from the Midwest, and a Nigerian doctor, I remember. And I'm like a kid. To me, that was a completely natural that you should see this kaleidoscope of humanity coming together to press the frontiers of knowledge and save lives. And it also imbues in you a real sense of like, boy, you better be serious about making a difference in the world. Whatever you choose to do, I mean, you could not have shown your face around our dinner table without that being part of your life's work. But then, when I was probably 12 or 13 years old, I started working the front desk in my mom's office whenever I got out of school early. And I tell the story in the book, but I remember going to my mom at one point and saying, an ultrasound here costs $300, right? And she's like, kind of. Right. So the kind of confuses me, because it seems like insurance pays us some fraction of that, but it's hard to tell how much and when. And then if someone doesn't have insurance, we charge them maybe less, or we don't need as much. But then if someone comes in and needs to pay cash, then they pay more. What is happening? And do we have any idea what an ultrasound actually costs to do here? And she kind of chuckled and was like, yeah, but it has nothing to do with the price. And I was like, why? And it leads me to this discussion I say in the book, that I would challenge you to find one person in all of America who thinks that the medical system we have here makes sense. As the Clinton family said, we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. We spend almost 20 cents on the dollar of the whole U.S. economy on healthcare. And yet, for people who are not wealthy and well-connected, we have kind of middling healthcare results. So it always upsets me when people say we have the best healthcare in the world in America. If you are wealthy and you live next to the right hospital, you sure do, and we have the best of the best. If you are just in some rural community in America, it's a total crapshoot, and you're getting probably worse healthcare on average than you're getting in like the Netherlands, or let's call it Denmark, just for fun these days. And that is a national tragedy with the amount of money we spend on this. And then the last thing I'll say is, going back to your very first question, Mate, of like the investment. Like, we're making an investment, a national investment of 1/5 of every dollar in a system that waits for us to get so sick that we become hugely expensive. Like, when you have a heart attack and you show up at a hospital, you are an expensive problem, right? Not to mention the fact you might die. And you are willing to essentially pay anything except for, actually, you're not paying. The insurance is paying. And so you have this system where everyone's divorced from the outcomes. It's super expensive. And maybe just having gone to see a doctor once a year for the last 5 years would have prevented the heart attack, which would be a way cheaper intervention. Can't we agree? So in every sense, growing up as the son of scientists and doctors gave me a reverence for innovation, for science, for what humans are capable of doing, for outcome of the investment in things like biotechnology and the age-old partnership between the public and private sector there, which is a treasure, a national treasure, but also a deep sense of dissatisfaction with the iniquities in the system, the nonsense in the system, and just how damn expensive we have made it to stay healthy as a country.
On the investment side, you and I looked at least one investment in a new startup that's trying to revolutionize the way that diagnostics is done in healthcare. What are some of the themes that you're seeing there, where, to your point about prevention, and as a way to not just save more lives, but also reduce costs? What kind of innovations are you excited about in the healthcare space from a company startup perspective?
I'm blown away every day. We get a healthcare deck a day, if not 2 or 3. What is possible right now is astonishing. Just the use of data. A scientist in my grandfather's generation would have killed to have the kind of data and real-time access to information and being able to slice and dice things that we can do now. It would have required him to have, supercomputer time, and now it can be done on our cell phone. And the advent of AI is also very promising in a lot of ways. I footnote my concerns in certain senses of the kind of guardrail-less advent of AI, but for healthcare, boy, it's really exciting. And then just the advent of new therapies and what we're able to do. I mean, cancer, my grandfather, a famous oncologist, was always fond of saying that cancer is an implacable. It's almost like a human, and it adapts. It's wily. For anyone who's had a family member who died of cancer, my mom passed of cancer, you know how it rips someone away from you. And so fighting it with all the tools of our modern society is exciting, and it should be a moonshot. And it should be something that the private sector and public sector foot the bill for together, right? That's always what's happened. I'll give you another example. I have been public about the fact that I'm on a GLP-1. The revolution in medical affairs of the United States of GLP-1s, which are having an impact on weight, on then secondary morbidities, as the doctors would call them, things that happen when you're overweight. My wife, actually, who's amazing in every way, was worried about me going on GLP-1s originally because she said, do you know you got to stay on those things, right, to see the outcomes lifetime? Are you worried about what might happen if you have to be for life on something that people have only been on for a few years? And I said, well, it's longer than a few years because these drugs are in diabetes treatment for a while. But also, we don't know exactly what will happen. I'm not 100% certain, but we know definitely what happens if I stay 100 pounds overweight. And I'm going to die in any of 10 different ways. And so I'll take this option. But here's the kicker. GLP-1s come from an obscure government grant into studying the saliva of the Gila monster lizard. And I promise you, can you imagine bringing a deck for like, I want to check out why Gila monsters aren't hungry frequently to a venture capitalist?
That'd be great.
You're right. I mean, it's just 0% chance. Right? And so the fact it went through the traditional, very effective, again, a crown jewel of the U.S. innovation economy, which is bench science funded by the NIH and its ilk, then through universities, then to the private sector for commercialization, then to large publicly traded companies for mass commercialization. And it's kicking butt, right? Let's do more of that.
Yeah. And are we doing more of that, or how can we change?
No, we just massacre public funding for science, which is just, this is actually kind of like a future murder, right? Because people whose lives would have been saved by things that were in progress. I mean, I can tell you from the personal experience of my family and the folks we know in science, like that's a real, I mean, real impact on active inquiries that are being stopped. And again, I don't mean this as a partisan statement, but like that is an own goal of epic proportions, which may cost people their lives, will cost people their lives. Could we restart it? Is it game over? No, of course not. Like we have enormous reservoirs of talent and inquiries yet to do here in this country. Time's a ticking. And it is a huge benefit for our country to have been the center, the haven of science. Where did all the scientists want to go after World War II? I mean, even the...
Oh, yeah.
Right?
We have rockets and all these fun technologies thanks to them.
Yeah, well, here, right? Yeah. We ought to want that to continue.
Is there some of these government program revamps there's the whole Doge cost overruns. There's some underlying philosophy as to why you want to revolutionize or revamp some of these programs. I'm curious, in this example with NIH, does that still apply, or is it more so where it's more of a venture capitalist kind of philosophy to investing, where we're going to seed a bunch of stuff? Efficiency is a desired feature. Inefficiency is a desired feature of the system because you want to be able to fund the loon shot ideas that sometimes will turn into something great. So I'm curious, is there room to innovate and revamp that, or was it the way it was just fine because that's what the system was supposed to do?
For NIH director, please. That would be the right philosophy, I think. And look, I mean, I would actually say with probably more investments, because let me take it back to a first principle in the book, which is neither political party has all the answers, and neither one is also wrong about everything. I think there are a lot of people in this town in New York who want to believe that the Trump administration is wrong about everything. And I'm here to say that that is not true. There's much about this administration that I disagree with and that I wish weren't happening. But the Doge effort, while I think done ham-handedly and broke more than it fixed, is coming from a good place, just some fundamental misunderstandings, right? So for example, gutting a public funding of science doesn't really save the country a lot of money. If you know how our federal budget breaks down, it's a fingernail of the federal budget, but the net benefits of seeding all these ideas gets you GLP-1s, for example, right? And many other, I mean, virtually every other major therapy, right? So I think there is something, though, that we ought to take from it. In the book, I recommend that we create a new office of the Chief Operating Officer of the United States, but it would be unusual. It would be a 10-year office, a little bit like the chairman of the Fed. So you'd bake in institutional memory. It would be kind of like the intelligence community when I served there, an apolitical office. You would not have a political appointee. And it would have a Fair Regulation Commission underneath it that would actually go comb through the Code of Federal Regulations, possibly with an AI assist, and try and find all the kind of absolute BS regulations that don't make any sense anymore. And if we had that office, we would do kind of a much more efficient than has normally been done, but slightly less destructive than Doge version of what Doge was trying to do. And I think that would be really important because every administration that's ever come into office in the US has started some sort of government efficiency commission. And usually like 3.5 years into an administration, they publish a report and nothing happens. Doge, on the other hand, was like frighteningly effective at acting, very questionable as to whether those actions actually were what needed to happen, right? And if you could just cut right in between those things and have a much more aggressive, active, but also thoughtful version of that, then that would be a really good thing for me.
Yeah. What do you relate to that? I'm curious how I'm curious about the scientific education part of it, especially as it ties into immigration. We run a data science company. We recruit from some of the best schools here in New York City. And I myself, I got a master's in math. People might be surprised to learn that most kids who go get a master's in math are not from America. And it's a function of like, okay, even if we wanted to hire Americans, in some fields, for better or worse, opt attracting American students. And combined with an immigration policy that sends those kids back home, like what can we do from an educational perspective to train people? Yeah, the jobs, there's all sorts of jobs that require more technical like trade skills, but there are also the more like nerdy scientific jobs that require you to be in a lab or be in a math library for a long period of time, struggling with a problem that is no longer seen as like cool or desirable for American kids to want to pursue.
And that's extremely important. Let me quickly start with immigration because I think to me it's very clear. Immigration is one of America's national superpowers. It is a unique feature of this country and unique in certain ways. Number one, it's sustained attractiveness to immigrants. I mean, there's never been a time in American history where we weren't attracting immigrants. And at a time where many countries are struggling with shrinking workforces and the ratio between their elderly and their working population, we actually, for the first time in a long time, had a decrease in that rate this year because of the immigration policy. I find it also inspiring that in America, people who are both like destitute, frightened, and fleeing, and also rich and well-educated all want to come here. And that is also something that we should celebrate. But very important to note, the Trump administration has a point insofar as that we let the system get definitionally out of control, right? It is also not appropriate for our country to have millions of people running around where we don't know who they are, what they're doing, where they are. Most of those people are just trying to eke out a living, right? And most of them are kind of paying some version of taxes and working in jobs that Americans don't want to do, not just mathematician or data scientist, but also gardener and home health aide. And the unspoken subsidy of that to our economy, 23% of construction workers undocumented. If we kick all those folks out and we try and have Americans, one, there aren't enough Americans to do it. And number two, the cost will go 2 to 3x, right? And that's a huge problem for an economy where affordability is already an issue, right? So immigrate, we just have to be smarter and more effective and efficient and data driven about the way in which it happens, but we should celebrate it's happening and we should make ourselves once again welcoming and attractive to it. And both at the most senior, as you know, 48% of unicorns are founded by immigrants, right? And enormous swaths of the technical workforce. Now, second part of your question, education. I mean, one of the most critical investments you can make in the country. And in the book, I go so far as to say pre-K and community college should be free. There's probably some version of that can happen. But I think those are investments because, to your point, we need an educated population. In the advent of AI and robotics, people are going to need more education. And in the age of social media and the tsunami of crappy information that we get every day, being able to parse information effectively is also going to become democracy won't work without people being educated enough to tell the difference between the BS and the stuff that's correct. So a huge investment in education is necessary. And then the last thing I'll say on this, I propose a jobs of national priority program in the book. I don't know whether the question you're asking is a branding problem or otherwise, but one thing we could do is for a bunch of clear jobs of national priority, data science, defense, nurses, home health aides, electricians, plumbers, that sort of thing, right? Teachers. It should be basically free to get the education as an investment from the public sector in that. You should get a tax abatement at least for several years of your career. And there should be other things that we do to incentivize you to want to take up those jobs.
The point you had made about post-World War II and people coming back home, there was a giant boom, not just in the economy, but also in scientific progress. My branding point is, it would be interesting to spend, to be honest, I haven't done too much thinking about this, but it was back then, it was seen as cool and, dare I say, sexy to be a rocket scientist. And there's something about that when you make it like sexy to be like it can be any of these jobs that are vital to national security or to the growth of the country. To then make that, and it could be like the plumbers, it could be the nurses, it could be whatever. Then there's an aspirational component to it where it's not seen as second class citizen, as someone who does this kind of a job or this kind of a trade. But no, like those jobs are actually like really, really cool. And it's something that's hard to do. Only a few people can master them, as a way to then attract the younger generation to be like, oh no, that's really cool and it's worth pursuing.
I often wondered what would happen if you turned like a Simon Cowell loose on national challenge branding. So I'll give you an example. Elon Musk has made himself reasonably complicated lately, but let's just stipulate to the fact that the companies he's built are incredibly impressive and world changing, right? And I mean, it actually is kind of heartbreaking to see, the EV revolution that America fomented and that was embodied in Tesla kind of get short shrift in the last year. But at the end of the day, I remember when I saw those boosters land on a floating platform in the ocean, like I literally I was obsessed with the Apollo program when I was growing up, and I literally had tears in my eyes. Like I was like, this is the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen. And it was just like, this is a moment of like human achievement. And like, we just took a thing into space and then landed on a buoy in the middle of the water. Like that has got to be one of the most inspiring. And you know what happened? Like a few people saw that, like it had trended on social media a little bit, but like, where is the fact that there's an address from the Oval Office that night? Look at what we've wrought. And by the way, SpaceX, private, but heavily publicly funded. Tesla, also private, doesn't survive '08 without a massive loan guarantee from the Department of Energy. And so, again, we can take credit as a people. The biggest partners that Elon Musk ever had were not his investors. They were the American taxpayer. Every Tesla ever sold has three parties in the transaction: Tesla, the buyer, and the federal government in the form of an $8,000 tax credit. So we should take pride in these moments, and we should make them cool again, to your point. Like, we do need to do some branding work on this, because if people look and they think the coolest thing in the world is launching a new social media site versus landing boosters from space to reuse them to make it possible for us to populate other planets, I mean, what the hell are we doing?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. At that point around government investments required to create these novel feats of human ingenuity, say more about that. The entire section in the book dedicated to the role of the government in enabling this. What else can be done?
It's a microcosm of strong flow, no ceiling. I think that almost everything that is of great significance that this country has accomplished. And look, it goes both ways, right? And we think about winning World War II as something that was done by like the U.S. military and the government and Franklin Roosevelt and generals, but actually like an enormous part of it was the industrial might. And there's like a 1,000-page book called The Wages of Destruction, which is about the economy of the Third Reich. Like, one of the biggest problems that the economy of the Third Reich had is as industrious as Germans were, they set up their industry incorrectly for the war. Hitler thought it was cool to have some really powerful tanks, and so the Germans would churn out very low numbers of these very advanced tanks. And if you put one of their Panthers or Tigers against 5 of our Shermans, it was a bad day for the Shermans. But the problem was we had like 50 Shermans for every Tiger tank. If you look at the way that the Soviets survived World War II, it was through immense bleeding on the population of Russia's behalf and American industrial might. Because the Jeeps and 2.5-ton trucks and planes and tanks and artillery shells for the whole world, the arsenal of democracy, we called it, were done here in America. And that was a public-private partnership too. So if you look at everything worth doing, the science moonshots and healthcare moonshots to winning wars, it's always a partnership between the sectors. And we forget that. And so people ask me if I'm for big government or small government. I'm for Goldilocks government. I'm for just right. I'm for let the private sector do what it does and let the government help where it can and let the people do everything they can to strive. And then we will have greatness going forward. It's not automatic. It's earned. And this is a smart way to earn it.
What are some of the other ways to earn that? What are some of your favorite ideas in the book?
Through your skilled questioning, we have talked about a lot of them. I do think it's worth mentioning, is you were focusing a little bit on the military early on. And I think there's a big misperception on the left about the role of the military, national defense, and then an equally big perception on the right about foreign policy and foreign aid. All of these things are a big investment. I give a great example that I love, which is, people complain about sending money to Ukraine. Right? So, why does America care so much about Ukraine? Well, we could talk about the history and the importance of NATO and holding the line against an expansionist Russian dictatorship with Vladimir Putin and supporting our friends. But there are a couple of other things that play there. First of all, we gave our word to Ukraine when they gave us their nuclear weapons, because, they ended up with a whole bunch of fissile material, the fall of the wall. And we promised them that if they gave us that and got rid of it, unilateral nuclear disarmament, that we would have their back. But at least we were sending them money and weapons. So then the question becomes, what does it mean to send money to our allies? Well, as it turns out, there's a famous weapon system, very advanced artillery round, and it's made a big difference for our friends in Ukraine. HIMARS has cost the Ukrainians billions of dollars. We have supplied those billions of dollars. But those billions of dollars were spent in Camden, Arkansas, which is where we build HIMARS, not overseas. And I'd prefer to keep American workers in the factory than in the trenches, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Resonated with me based on what you just said is the value of promises. And you can make the financial argument, make the jobs argument. There is a moral argument to also be made about the value of a promise and how far you'd go to keep a promise that you made to somebody.
Well, I go pretty far. I think it's really important to have, and look, I think we're in an era where people either sell something out completely or go down fighting unnecessarily. Like, I think it's perfectly patriotic to say that America, we've usually tried. I usually think if we were in a Marvel comic strip that America's like the good guy. It doesn't mean that we're flawless, and we have certainly screwed up multiple times, but we were always kind of trying to show up as the good guy. My biggest sadness is the last years, I feel like in some cases these days we haven't been. A tragedy for America, but also for the world. Equally, I would say, I go through in the book, because I'm kind of an institution, like we run a country of 350 million people. There's got to be some institutions here. But I make it very clear that I am not writing a book to defend the institutions that have gone in the past, because largely those institutions have kind of failed us, right? I mean, when we go dial back the clock to a very seminal moment in American history, which is the twin hammer blows, as I call them, of Vietnam and Watergate, we kind of lose faith at the same time in our righteousness overseas. This is a generation that had all witnessed World War II, where we were so righteous and so committed, where the popularity of the war was overwhelming, right? And the involvement of our society was full body. Then we go to Vietnam, and most of America doesn't really get what we're doing there. And then you get like the Pentagon Papers, and you realize the government's lying to you. And now we frittered away. You know, we've got boys dying, and we don't know why, and the government's lying to us, and that's a problem. And then you've got Watergate and Richard Nixon lying, going down in flames, and suddenly you start to see this like erosion of trust in institutions. And then this attacks the private sector through things like the flame retardant industry, the cigarette industry, et cetera, where they're also shown then to be lying to their customers who trusted them. And what ends up happening is you get to recent times and nobody trusts a damn thing, right? I mean, and not only that, but we've balkanized ourselves in the way we talked about before, geographically and digitally. Social media only reinforces your existing beliefs and mistrusts. And suddenly everybody's an expert in everything. Everybody thinks everything is BS. It's really hard as a society to believe that anyone's keeping their promises if you mistrust them. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that people kind of hate the Republican Party, and they hate the Democratic Party, and they feel like they've been misled. And by the way, one of the fundamental misunderstandings about American politics is that the parties are static. They move. They're like tectonic plates, you know, earth and earthquakes. The Democratic Party at one point had a lot of racist Southern senators, the Dixiecrats, who wanted not to allow civil rights, and they left the party after Lyndon Johnson. And then the Republican Party used to be, you know, like a small government, very internationalist party. Now, I think under Trump, that's very much changed. And the Democratic Party is undergoing its own internal battle, Democratic Socialists versus the centrist moderates and blue dogs. And so these parties are always on the move. But the one thing everyone can agree with right now is that basically nothing that either party has said in the last 20 years they've done. And as a Democrat myself, I think the Democrats have, you know, came pretty close to some of the things they were trying to do in the Biden administration, but didn't get there. Right. And so we need to re-earn people's trust in the promises made, because if you don't believe in promises, you went back to one of the earliest, you know, kind of the early times in human history. What's the first thing that had to happen? Some Neanderthal with a club had to trust some other Neanderthal with a club that working together was better than working apart. Trust is the fundamental thing.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that also has to do with the collective narrative that we have, to your point about if this was a Marvel movie, are we still the good guys? And when both sides of the aisle point a finger and tell the other that you're evil, we, even if you don't believe it, you start to internalize it. And if we've been calling each other evil for a long period of time, we can no longer say, yeah, maybe this is who we are. And we no longer hold ourselves up to this higher standard of when we thought that we were the superhero, albeit imperfect, but we tried to do the best. I'm curious if you think like stories or how we communicate to each other can change some of that narrative around making us feel, or at least try to internalize, I know we're actually good and flawed, but good. And we'll tell each other that, like, yeah, like I don't agree with you, but you're also good. Or we have the good of the country in mind. And then use that to overcome some of these challenges.
My answer to your question will risk sounding Pollyanna-ish or naive. So let me say first, you might be right in that you posit, and if you are right, then we're done here. Right? Like, I don't mean with the podcast, I mean with the country, right?
Done.
I'm out, right? But let's say that you're not right. Why might you not be right in the way that you're framing the question? And I think, one thing, I take hope from these really challenging times in our past. I mentioned the 30s and the 60s tree, but we did also come back from a civil war imperfectly, and it took a long time. But we killed well over 1 million Americans in that war, and somehow we ended up in the same country. So, it has been worse. And then the other thing is, it's not just like there's this tendency to drive apart. Like, we are being driven apart. And actually, certain technologies, and I am far from a Luddite, I'm a tech investor, right? But like, I think in the past, we have rolled out technologies with more concern and guardrails. Give you an example. The same technologies, the nuclear technologies that gave us some of those powerful weapons in the world also gave us power plants that are a huge part of baseload power in America. And those are commercial, but there are a lot of rules around them, right? I mean, there's a lot of things you have to do, a lot of money you have to spend to do them properly. Social media is the nuclear power plants of media and information. And in a democracy, the shared availability of fairly good information broadly is like the input, right? And would you argue right now that we have broadly available quality information that's shared?
Side of the system too. No.
Of system two being the shining counter.
Exactly. Yeah.
Other than that,
podcast on the hill that
that's
all
right.
others should look up to.
Amen. And I may have become the most popular in the world, but short of that, it's bad luck, right? That's not what we have. And we can change that because we are forcing people. Zeynep Tufekci, a great social scientist, did some studies early on about how YouTube's autoplay feature was really fascinating because she originally had thought that it would continue to autoplay stuff that you wanted to see based on the thing that you'd seen. But actually it wants to keep you. And so it has to amp things up. And so if you started watching a YouTube video about a truck, you would eventually end up autoplaying to monster trucks because it would have to get more and more compelling and absurd to keep you focused hour after hour. Well, the same stands for the politics is one of the reasons why you'd start with a Hillary Clinton speech, you'd end up with Lenin, or you'd start with a Trump speech, you'd end up with Hitler, right? You'd have to push you all the way. So we're not just like failing as a society to trust one another. We are being driven apart by certain structural things. And by the way, it's not just social media. It's also our leaders. I mean, we've not set up the system to attract the best and the brightest to our leadership, right? And I mean, Donald Trump is kind of famous for being divisive, but actually there were elements of the Biden administration that were divisive too. I mean, there was a really important moment where Joe Biden does not invite Elon Musk to, I don't have insider knowledge of this, but I mean, that is just a bad decision. And he should have been there because whether or not you agree with Elon Musk, he has a very important role in our electric vehicle industry. And that sets Elon on the path of, Doge and supporting the Republican Party. So both sides are doing kind of vindictive, nasty things to one another, and we ought to expect more. And to your original question, we better hope that you're.
No, I rarely am wrong. So we'll see how you're thoughtful, you're measured. It's not just everything's black or white. We're going to shift. I would love to hear more about your process. What do you read? How do you stay on top of these things? And then maybe even throw in that famous spreadsheet that you mentioned to me at one point where you help connect the dots between people you meet and things you're working on. What is the process behind staying organized with all that?
So at the heart of the answer to that is actually the fact that I'm very blessed with a network of people who know more about everything that I want to know about and who are willing to help teach me and educate me and tell me what to read and stuff like that. I often feel self-conscious about not having like a regimen of like, oh, these are the podcasts and the things that I listen to. I mean, there are certainly, and by the way, like a lot of my time is quote wasted listening Star Trek and Star Wars updates, for what's coming down the pike from Disney, because I love that stuff, or watching tennis, which I do obsessively. But at the end of the day, the network and, the system that you mentioned, a kind of custom CRM that I designed because my network is a little bit larger than most CRMs are able to do. More importantly, it's more fractionalized in terms of how I've got the venture firm and all of its portfolio companies and all of its funds. I've got the nonprofit and all of its work in all these countries and across America. I've got the book now. I've got my family stuff. And it was just too much for any CRM to figure out how to apply thousands of contacts against dozens and dozens of prospective tasks. But at the end of the day, what that is me kind of sitting at the center of this web of talent and capacity and knowledge. And you're right. I always wanted to be like my grandfather, who could talk a little bit about anything. And whether it's Gila monsters or music or whatever you want to talk about, Star Wars, I'm here for it. There are people in each of those areas that far more than me. And my superpower is I know who they are and I can call them and they're willing to talk.
Maybe we can end on a topic that's closer to home. I'm curious what you were like as a kid, but then also comparing that to how you are now as a father to young children. What would you say to your young self? Have you accomplished all the things that you thought you were going to accomplish as a kid? And what advice would you have for your kids to live a better American dream?
This is exactly the right place to end, because all of this is eventually for that, both for little me and for my kids, all of my fellow citizens. I was a kid. Maybe the best anecdote I can share with you, my parents lost me at one point and, couldn't get far, right? So no big deal. But they called, I was 4.
Okay.
So they called downstairs to the doorman and they were like, hey, he hasn't walked out of here, has he? And they were like, no, he's in the elevator. And what? And what's he doing in the elevator? It's been 20 minutes. And he appears to be shaking hands with people. I was running for president, and I unfortunately did not get elected, although the building was very supportive. And so I've been that kid, forever, right? So actually probably the least surprising thing for my friends is to hear me, talking to you about stuff like this, because it's like super predictable that I would be doing this. Have I accomplished everything? No. I mean, little kid me would be like, what, you're not president now? So, I mean, no. But also would never have, like, little me would be like, oh, why are you not president yet? But actually the road has winded, and it did for a reason that takes me back to how I learned to be a parent, which is both my parents and my mom's parents. I was very close to my grandparents. That group of 4 adults was hugely impactful for me. When I left government service after college, I actually thought I might run for office right off the jump, right? I was like, it was an era where incumbency was very powerful, which it is not anymore, or not nearly as much. And so I was like, I'll go be an alderman somewhere. And my grandfather, they sat me down and was basically like, that's really stupid. You don't know anything yet. I mean, you're bright. You pick up stuff quickly. Fine. Congratulations. But, when people bring you their real problems, you will have no idea what it's like to have a job, to be fired from a job, to have a kid, to take that kid to the hospital, to have to pay medical bills, to run a business, and to deal with paying taxes. None of that. You have no actual frame of reference. Go do some stuff first, build some things. And then if you still want to be a public servant, you might actually have something to offer. So little kid, I mean, I can barely count, right? I mean, I'm dyslexic and I suck at math and science. To run a venture capital firm, first of all, I have to be surrounded with people who can. So thank God for them. Hello, team. But second of all, like, I would never have expected it, but interacting with the innovation ecosystem, which, to take it all the way back to one of your first questions, is like all the sectors working together. The American innovation system is like the best of the private sector, the best of our talented population, the best of our ideas, the best of our public funding and science, the best of our universities, all working in one little area of our economy, which everyone envies, right? And being there made Strong Flow No Ceiling possible. I've never made a secret of the fact that I hope one day to run for office. Won't happen soon. I've got a lot of work to do at the firm and with our companies and investors. But if I do end up having success with that, as little Oliver would have wanted, it'll be because of this journey. Being a parent has made this all so much more important, because you're only here for so long. It's theoretical until you have kids. But one of the other things that it made me do is want to spend a ton of time with them in a way that I might not have thought possible before, and certainly before COVID. And so I put my son to bed pretty much every night, and my daughter as well, oftentimes. I want them to live in a country with a strong floor and no ceiling. It's why I'm doing this. And I hope that I can be as good a parent as my parents and grandparents were, because I was very blessed growing.
So if your kids come to you after spending an hour riding the elevator petitioning for votes, would you advise them the same, the advice that you got to, or what would you change in that advice?
That was a no notes kind of thing. It was really good advice. And I think we've lost something in that we have professional politicians. The founding, it was meant to be a stop that you made in your life, and you could make an impact and you could do it for a while, but you were a civilian and you left and became a civilian again. And look, the country's different than it was then. And so it's not a perfect analogy, but we ought to want our elected officials and our leaders and appointed leaders to have relevant experience and to have gone through, fire tempering in life, and perhaps to want to reemerge and do more of that and not just go into public speaking and lobbying. And if we can achieve that, then we'll have a better chance of achieving all the things we've talked about today.
Well, Oliver, thank you so much for speaking to me today about all this. I think it's, I should go out and buy the book. It's not like other books you see out there. We're going to be rational, speak to issues on both sides, and come up with solutions that can actually work. So thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Mate, thanks so much. And by the way, I'd be remiss not to say I'm honored to be here with and your audience. Your story, your innovations, the business you run is a big part of what I mean by strong flow, no ceiling. And you are certainly a good example of it, which is why I was so excited to be here for this conversation. So thank you for the great questions and for having me here.
Thanks again.